Perhaps Spirit should have died a very long time ago. It was only built to survive for 90 days on Mars. But somehow that small machine kept going for more than 6 years across a cold and alien world. It survived landings that seemed impossible to endure, system failures that could have ended the entire mission, and journeys into regions no human footprint had ever reached. But then, when Spirit began climbing a hill that seemed completely harmless, everything started to change. What was waiting on the other side? Because what Spirit discovered afterward didn't just change the way we see Mars, it also revealed a mysterious past that had remained buried for billions of years. Welcome to Astrexo. And today, we continue Spirit's journey across the Red Planet. We returned to Spirit exactly 1 year after it set its wheels down on Mars. On the slopes of Husband Hill, it was approaching a rock with a rather interesting name: Champagne. But for Rover, the idea of celebration carried an entirely different meaning. No ceremony, no moment of remembrance, only silence and a series of meticulous measurements. Alone in the barren landscape, Spirit began by grinding away the weathered surface layer to reveal the original rock beneath, the part most likely to preserve the planet's true history. It then carried out observations at an extremely small scale, where subtle details in the rock's structure could reveal how it had formed. Once those images had been captured, the analyses continued to determine exactly which elements made up the rock. And deeper still, using Musbauer spectroscopy, Spirit could identify specific mineral forms, offering clues to the environment in which this rock had once existed. Step by step, without rushing, Spirit was doing what it had been built to do: reading the past of Mars through tiny but meaningful traces hidden inside a seemingly lifeless stone. However, shortly after that series of measurements, the Spirit operations team detected a small but noteworthy issue: a short circuit with a voltage of only about 0.1 volts. At that point, the anomaly wasn't severe enough to interfere with the rover's daily operations, but it served as a clear warning that Spirit was becoming more vulnerable to failures in the future. Even so, the journey continued. Spirit remained stable as it slowly worked its way up dust-covered slopes, where every move had to be calculated more carefully than before to avoid the risk of getting stuck. What made things even more challenging wasn't just the terrain, but the atmosphere above. The increasing density of dust was reducing the sunlight, the rover's only source of energy. Some of that dust didn't just hang in the air, it also settled directly onto the surface of the solar panels, forming a thin layer that was enough to reduce their efficiency. And from that moment on, every decision about route planning or energy usage was no longer just about optimization. It had become a matter of survival. However, on its journey toward an observation point known as Larry's Lookout on the slopes of Cumberland Ridge, Spirit didn't miss a single opportunity to stop and study its surroundings. Before climbing higher, it analyzed two small rocks named Peace and Alligator, samples that might have seemed insignificant, yet could hold important clues about the region's geological history. And then, as it looked farther into the distance, Spirit captured an image of another rock, far larger and completely out of reach. It wasn't a surface formation at all, but Phobos, Mars's largest moon, a satellite about 26 kilometers in diameter, silently moving across the sky. According to current models, Phobos's orbit is gradually decaying, and in about 10 million years, it may no longer exist as a moon, instead colliding with or breaking apart as it drifts too close to the planet it orbits. After completing its imaging tasks, Spirit continued moving along the slopes of Cumberland Ridge, inching forward across hazardous terrain. But that journey was suddenly interrupted by an unplanned stop. During one of its drives, NASA engineers noticed that one of Spirit's wheels had inadvertently churned up an unusual patch of soil, a site that would later be named Paso Robles. And it was here that things began to get far more interesting. Analysis revealed that this soil contained extremely high concentrations of salts, along with notable levels of phosphorus, a chemical combination that doesn't easily form without the presence of water. But what did that really mean? At the time, scientists didn't have a clear answer, but one thing was almost certain. This environment had once been strongly influenced by water in the past. It was an accidental discovery, yet it opened an entirely new perspective on the history of Mars. And more importantly, it set the stage for an even more surprising breakthrough. One that would emerge from the very failures Spirit would face later on. Spirit began adjusting the way it moved in a way that almost felt counterintuitive. Instead of continuing forward and putting more strain on its malfunctioning front wheel, it backed up in a controlled manner along the slope, letting that wheel glide lightly across the surface rather than pressing it down into the soft soil. A simple solution, yet one that significantly reduced energy consumption. From its vantage point at Larry's Lookout, Spirit captured a panoramic image on Sol 413. A vast scene where, if you look closely, you can trace the path of its journey along the right side, while on the left a rocky outcrop juts from the slopes of Cumberland Ridge, and farther beyond, Tennessee Valley stretches into view. This wasn't a single moment. The image was stitched together from 108 frames, each one itself a composite of multiple shots taken through different filters, creating a color image that closely matches what the human eye would perceive. At the center of that landscape, about 656 feet away and rising roughly 148 feet higher, the summit of Husband Hill appeared as a clear yet formidable objective. A journey expected to demand significant energy under increasingly harsh conditions. But just as everything seemed to be getting more difficult, a completely unexpected event changed everything. On Sol 421, dust devils swept past Spirit, causing no damage and instead clearing away nearly a year's worth of accumulated dust from its solar panels, boosting their efficiency from around 60% to as high as 93%, as if Mars itself had given it a second chance to keep going. Over the next 160 sols, Spirit steadily worked its way toward the summit, 1 meter at a time across increasingly harsh terrain. The improved energy supply not only allowed it to keep moving, but also unlocked another critical advantage: the ability to transmit data consistently back to Earth through the Odyssey orbiter after each sol. This made it possible for the science team to collect and process large amounts of data in real time throughout the journey. From soil and rock samples at sites like Paso Robles 2, Big Clod, Paso Dark, Methuselah, Keystone, Pittsburgh, Independence, and Franklin, without overwhelming the rover's limited onboard memory. By Sol 581, Spirit finally reached one of the first peaks of Husband Hill. But for it, this was not the end. Instead of stopping, Spirit carried out one of its most ambitious tasks: capturing a full 360-degree panorama assembled from 653 individual images, revealing, for the first time, the entire upper structure of the rover itself within a single frame. And if you look closely, the solar panels at this point were nearly completely clean. A small detail, yet one that carried life or death significance for the remainder of the mission. As night fell over the summit, Spirit turned its camera toward the sky, capturing both of Mars's moons, Phobos and Deimos, helping scientists refine their orbital models with greater precision. In that panoramic image, far in the distance where the horizon meets the sky, the hills McCool and Ramon emerged as the next destinations, especially McCool, which had been expected to serve as an ideal winter haven. Allowing Spirit to tilt its solar panels toward the sun to maximize energy intake during the low-light months. But reality didn't unfold according to that plan. And from this point on, Spirit's journey entered a different phase. Stay with us to see what it would accomplish in the final 2.6 kilometers of its life. As it began its journey down from Husband Hill, Spirit wasn't simply descending a slope. It was also taking part in a rare coordinated effort with the Hubble Space Telescope, working together to observe the Martian sky in order to refine measurements related to atmospheric opacity and calibration targets. The collaboration between an instrument orbiting Earth and a small machine on the surface of Mars allowed scientists to fine-tune their data with greater precision, as if two distant worlds were focusing on the same point to better understand the space between them. What's remarkable is that throughout this journey, Spirit was no longer exactly the same as it had been at launch. Despite being hundreds of millions of miles away from its engineers, it was continuously evolving. Software updates sent while it was climbing the hill gradually expanded the rover's capabilities, enabling it to navigate autonomously in certain situations, rather than relying entirely on commands from Earth. And at a later stage, it could even make its own decisions: when to transmit data, when to prioritize storage, or whether to deploy its robotic arm to examine a rock. Over time, Spirit became more than just a machine executing instructions. It evolved into a system with an increasing level of autonomy, adapting to the harsh environment and the vast distance that separated it from humanity. However, even as Spirit was gradually leaving Husband Hill behind, there were still decisions it couldn't make on its own. The choice of which rock to analyze between two candidates, Comanche and Miami, remained in the hands of the team back on Earth. In the end, Comanche was selected, and it turned out to be a decision far more valuable than expected. When Spirit conducted its analysis on Sol 690, the results revealed that the rock contained a large amount of magnesium iron carbonate, making up roughly 1/4 of its structure, nearly 10 times higher than anything previously recorded on Mars. This wasn't just an impressive number. Carbonate salts play a crucial role in reconstructing the history of water, because they form in the presence of water but are easily destroyed in acidic conditions. That leads to a remarkable possibility. This region may once have hosted neutral, more stable water environments than we had ever imagined. Conditions that could have been suitable for early forms of life in the planet's distant past. It was a discovery with profound implications. But Spirit's journey didn't stop there. It kept moving forward and by Sol 744 reached an area known as Home Plate. Here, the geology began telling a different story, with layered rock formations shaped and eroded over time, especially along the edges of the region. Looking at those structures, it's difficult to explain them by any mechanism other than flowing water, as if water once moved through this place, leaving its mark within every remaining layer of sediment. But it wasn't the terrain or the rocks that challenged Spirit the most. It was time itself, the quiet force slowly wearing the machine down. As it moved toward the northern slopes of McCool Hill around March 2006, a serious failure occurred. One of its wheels stopped working. Tests conducted back on Earth at JPL, recreating the same conditions, failed to find any way to restore that wheel's movement. From that moment on, Spirit was forced to continue its journey in an entirely different way. Instead of rolling smoothly, it dragged its locked right front wheel, leaving long tracks etched across the Martian surface. And at the same time, another threat was closing in. The Martian winter was approaching, bringing with it a steady decline in sunlight, the rover's only source of energy. As the light faded, so did the amount of power it could generate. These two factors, one mechanical failure and the other an unforgiving environment, forced NASA to make a difficult decision: abandon the attempt to reach McCool Hill and instead search for a safer place to survive the winter. The new destination was Low Ridge Haven, where Spirit found a slope of about 11 degrees, just enough to tilt its solar panels toward the sun and maximize the energy it could collect, giving it a fighting chance to survive yet another winter on the red planet. For nearly 8 months, Spirit remained almost stationary on the slope. Not because it couldn't move, but because every decision now had to prioritize survival. Instead, it used its position to observe and document the landscape around it. And then, in one of those images, engineers back on Earth noticed something unusual. Amid the familiar surface of rock and dust, two objects stood out with characteristics unlike anything around them. They were quickly identified as iron-rich meteorites. These two samples were named Zhongshan and Allen Hills, names that echo Antarctica on Earth, where many meteorites of Martian origin have been discovered. In particular, Allen Hills is linked to one of the most famous meteorites ever studied, a sample found in 1996 that sparked global attention when NASA scientists suggested it might contain fossilized traces of extraterrestrial life. The images released at the time spread rapidly across the world, becoming one of those rare moments when the question of life beyond Earth no longer felt like pure speculation, but seemed to move one step closer to an answer. As the Martian winter slowly faded, sunlight returned, and with it the energy Spirit had been waiting for. Once again, it left its winter haven and continued its journey. Then, in March 2007, something unexpected happened. Not from a carefully planned operation, but from its own malfunction. The broken wheel, once a liability, accidentally dug into the soft red soil, exposing a completely different layer beneath, bright white silica. This discovery, on its own, wasn't direct evidence of life, but it carried far greater significance than it might seem. It pointed to environmental conditions that could once have supported life. On Earth, silica-rich environments are often linked to hydrothermal systems, where hot water and material from deep beneath the crust interact with the surface, places where life can emerge or thrive. Scientists believe the silica Spirit uncovered could have formed in one of two ways. Either through hot water dissolving silica and redepositing it elsewhere, similar to hot springs and geysers, or through acidic steam interacting with rock, stripping away most minerals and leaving behind primarily silica, creating formations known as fumaroles. In either case, both types of environments on Earth are capable of supporting microbial life. And perhaps most striking of all is how this discovery came to be. If Spirit hadn't malfunctioned, if its journey had ended sooner, this evidence might have remained forever buried beneath the dust of Mars. In the months that followed, Spirit continued moving around the home plate area, slowly but relentlessly. And then, in June 2007, it received something that could almost be called a miracle. Winds swept across the Martian surface, clearing away the layer of dust that had built up on its solar panels over time, giving Spirit what was essentially a full cleaning. Its energy output surged from a diminished level of around 120 watt-hours back up to over 600, a recovery strong enough to significantly extend a mission that had already far exceeded its original expectations. A few months later, on November 6th, Spirit moved to the western side of home plate and captured another panoramic image. A scene that at first glance seemed like a familiar stretch of Martian terrain, with layers of rock and soil spreading under a pale light. The image was later released by NASA as Astronomy Picture of the Day. But what made it truly remarkable wasn't the sweeping landscape itself. Looking closer, a small detail began to stand out. A strange shape embedded in the terrain quickly spread across the world, sparking imaginative speculation. Can you see it? A figure many called Little Bigfoot appeared to be hiding in plain sight, though in reality it was nothing more than a result of light and terrain combining to create a visual illusion so familiar to the human mind. And if you look to the right side of the frame, you can still see the tracks Spirit left behind from Husband Hill, a quiet reminder of the distance it had traveled. By this point, only a few hundred meters remained ahead of it. Yet it was precisely that short stretch that held the greatest challenges still waiting. But as the journey slowly approached its final chapter, the environment around Spirit became more unforgiving than ever. Martian dust storms grew both in intensity and frequency, covering the sky with such a dense veil that it nearly blocked out all sunlight. For a machine entirely dependent on solar power, this wasn't just an obstacle. It was a direct threat to its survival. Dust accumulated thickly on the panels, pushing its energy production down to dangerous levels. Spirit could now generate only about 128 watt-hours, below the minimum needed to maintain its operating temperature. And on a world where the cold can destroy everything, not having enough energy to stay warm meant that critical systems would begin to shut down. Spirit's operations had to be scaled back, slower, more cautious, as if each passing day came with a cost. But then, once again, chance stepped in. 2 light cleaning events, likely from passing gusts of wind, removed part of the dust coating, allowing its energy output to recover to around 372 watt-hours. It wasn't a full recovery, but it was enough for Spirit to recharge and keep moving, once again delaying what had once seemed inevitable. But no matter how many obstacles it had overcome, time was the one force Spirit could never defeat. By April 2009, clear signs of decline began to emerge as its systems developed unexplained memory errors, as if the machine itself was slowly beginning to forget. At that point, Spirit was only a few meters away from what would become its final resting place. And then, on Sol 1892, it entered an area later named Troy, where almost all movement came to an end. The ground beneath it appeared firm, but in reality, it was an extremely soft, unstable layer containing jarosite, an iron-rich mineral with very low cohesion. That meant Spirit's wheels couldn't generate enough traction to break free. Every attempt to move only caused it to sink deeper into the soil. Back on Earth, engineers at JPL ran continuous tests, exploring every possible solution to rescue it. But all efforts led to the same conclusion. There was no way to get Spirit out of this natural trap. By Sol 2155, NASA officially redefined the mission. Spirit was no longer a rover, but a stationary science platform. Even without mobility, it kept working, conducting atmospheric measurements, capturing additional images, including its final panorama at Troy, and using its still-functional robotic arm to study the surrounding soil. In that state, Spirit didn't just endure. It continued to contribute data, maintaining a steady operational rhythm to make the most of its limited energy and keep critical systems running, as if it still wasn't ready to stop. But the final winter was closing in on Spirit. And this time, it was harsher than anything the small machine had ever endured. In the months that followed, the amount of energy it could generate continued to decline, little by little, until it reached a critical threshold on Sol 2196, with power barely enough to sustain minimal survival. And then, around Sol 2208, all signals suddenly disappeared. It's believed that Spirit entered a power-loss state in the deep cold of a lifeless world. There was no clear ending, no final goodbye, only a silence stretching across a planet that was already still. But that doesn't mean its journey ended gently. Left behind on the edge of home plate, with two wheels no longer functioning, its energy depleted, and communication gone, Spirit came to rest there alone. A silent witness to an entire era of exploration. Over 2,088 sols of operation. It traveled more than 7.7 kilometers and sent back over 128,000 images to Earth. Each frame helping reshape how we understand Mars. Its mission wasn't just fulfilled, it far exceeded every original expectation, especially in revealing the role of water and the potential for past life on the planet. And even though Spirit is no longer active, its legacy continues. Its name has been given to an asteroid, and the next generations of rovers like Perseverance carry its spirit forward, along with the memory of a journey that opened the door to even greater discoveries ahead. And that is the full journey of Spirit. A small machine that reshaped the way we see a distant world. If you're someone who loves space, thank you for staying and listening to the story all the way to the final seconds. Because journeys like this are not just about science, but about inspiration. About what humanity is truly capable of reaching. If you found value in this video, share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future documentaries about space, the moon, and the stories we'll continue to explore together. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next journey.